Welcome to the Bogart Effect, a wealthy wisdom podcast. The following Bogart Effect podcast is intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart or another investment professional. Please see important disclosure information at the end of the presentation. All right. Good morning. This is James Bogart, CEO and President of Bogart Wealth. Thank you for taking the time to join us for the Bogart Effect. With me today is Sydney Rutledge, one of our advisors in the Woodlands, Texas office. Thanks for joining, Sydney.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
So we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is Roth IRAs. And this is one that I would tell you, with my perspective with our clients, is probably the area we talk about the most, or at least spend the most time talking about. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding Roth IRAs. And, the hope is today, that Sydney and I are going to be able to dive into that a little bit. So Sydney, to start, why is this so important? Like this whole conversation around IRAs, Roth IRAs, et cetera.
Absolutely. So Roth IRAs, everyone wants to know how to get money into a Roth IRA. There's a couple different types of money in the financial world. Roth money is one of those types. The main benefit of Roth money is that it grows tax-free. There's all sorts of caveats and limitations about how you can get money into a Roth IRA, but that's the main reason why they're great. People are they're after that tax-free growth.
So to help explain this a little bit better, let's talk about the different account types in more detail, right? So there's Roth IRAs, as we're talking about. There's traditional IRAs. There's also after-tax non-qualified accounts. Why don't we break those down?
Yep, I agree. So we covered Roth IRAs. Traditional IRAs, those are pre-tax dollars that grow tax deferred. They're not taxed until they're withdrawn. And then you've got the brokerage side, which is after-tax money. And you can pull the money out at any time. There's no restrictions, but you will pay capital gains taxes if the money has grown.
Now, IRAs, let's talk about this a little bit. IRAs, that's pre-tax money. As you said, it grows tax deferred. But when you pull the money out, it's taxed how?
As ordinary income.
Yeah. So that's as if you earned it, right?
Correct.
And
that's correct.
I think each of these respective buckets has pros and cons. And, part of it is that I think the framework, a lot of our client base thinks everything needs to be in Roths. And I'm going to argue that's not in any way, shape, or form accurate. And the reason for that is because of the tax treatment associated with each one of those different types of accounts.
Yep, there's a place for each one of the buckets in everybody's plan.
Bingo, right? And this is where I think it's so important when someone is building out their savings profile and they're understanding the respective tranches of each. So when I think about it in the sense of like, if you're in a high income environment and you're in the peak earning years, for example, saving in a traditional IRA or 401k is not necessarily a bad thing because you get the benefit of bringing taxable income down.
Exactly.
And this is where we have a lot of educational content on Roths, and we do a lot of different examples that kind of shows the economics behind a traditional versus a Roth versus even an after-tax. And it's helpful because when you look at the progressive nature of the U.S. tax code, meaning, the first 10% of your income is taxed, then 12%, then 22%, then 24%, then 32%, then 35%, then 37%. Well, it's important to understand that when you get the tax deduction, it's at whatever the highest marginal bracket is that you're at. So for example, if you're at the top end of let's just use for a hypothetical of the 24% bracket, and then let's say you go and you save and you max out the pre-tax portion, you're saving everything at that highest marginal bracket. You bring your taxable income down there. But when it comes to how you spend your money, meaning when you withdraw it, it's actually your effective tax rate, your average tax rate. And this is the misconception that a lot of people end up having around why they believe everything should go into a Roth. Well, as Sydney already mentioned, when you put money in, it's on an after-tax basis. And so that after-tax money is then taxed at whatever that highest marginal bracket is that you're at that point in time. But when you go and you pull it out, it comes back to this effective average tax rate if you're comparing a traditional versus a Roth type of structure. And so from our perspective, we love Roths and really do see the value of a Roth in a portfolio. But we felt we needed to kind of set the frame as to why this is so important going into the discussion today, because there's a lot of misconceptions around it. So, Sydney, talk about some of the numbers behind the scope, like retirement planning in general, right?
Yep. Yep. And these are some of these numbers are a little bit scary. I would say that they're the average retirement savings for someone who is between the ages of 55 and 64 in this country is a little bit over $537,000, which that is a lot of money in general, like in normal terms. But for someone who's retirement age to only have that much saved, that's a little bit concerning. In 2022, there were 32.3 million households that had Roth IRAs, but only 15% of all U.S. households contributed to traditional or Roth IRAs in 2022. So the numbers, as far as people getting money into these accounts, is fairly low. You might have one open, but they're not actually using it.
Well, and maybe to even take a step out, there's 336 million Americans, right? So that's saying that less than 10% actually have a Roth IRA in general. Right. And if you kind of dive into the numbers even a little bit further, of the 336 million Americans, 4.8 million have more than $1 million of investable assets. And 1.8 million have more than 5 million of investable assets. So when you think about the scope and ultimately how really the framework behind these accounts, it's such a small subset of people who are actually even thinking about this, using them, saving. I mean, it's scary is a good word, right? I mean, because at the end of the day, I personally believe one of the largest deficiencies of America is we don't save. And I'd say overall, as a country, we're very financially illiterate. Exactly. And so, that's why we're doing these types of things to help educate, because I believe that an empowered investor is an educated investor is a very empowered investor. And so that's exactly why we want to talk about this and then talk about implementation. All right, so we've talked about the basics of a Roth. We've talked about the pros of a Roth. Let's dive into the cons a little bit more. As you mentioned, you got to pay tax now instead of later. How do we get money into a Roth?
Yep. So there are a couple different ways you can get money directly into a Roth. Contribution, that means directly contributing to a Roth IRA. Conversion.
Sorry, how much can I contribute?
So in 2024, the limit is $7,000 for if you're below the age of 50. If you're over age 50, you're allowed an extra $1,000 as a catch-up contribution.
And is there an income restriction on that?
There is, and that's one of the cons, is that there are income restrictions for direct contributions. Those income thresholds, they move up every couple of years for inflation. This year, for 2024, the phase-out limit, if you're married filing jointly, is $230,000 of household income. So if you make more than $230,000, you can't contribute directly to a Roth IRA. So then that kind of limits you. If you can't contribute directly, how else can you get money in? Conversion is the second way. That's taking pre-tax dollars and converting them to Roth dollars. And then the other is a rollover from an employer plan. You can roll if you're retiring, or you can do it. And some people have access to in-service withdrawals. They can do a rollover directly from their employer plan to a Roth IRA. Backdoor and mega backdoor are another way to get money into a Roth. But the main two that we see people doing are contribution directly and conversions.
So you mentioned backdoor and mega backdoor. That's probably at Bogart Wealth one of the number one strategies that we're employing for those that are actively employed. I want to dive into that a little bit more. So what is a backdoor first? Let's talk about that. And then we'll come and talk about a mega backdoor in a second.
So backdoor is those income restrictions we mentioned, $230,000 for married filing jointly. For single filers, it's $146,000. If you're above those thresholds, you can still get money into a Roth IRA. It just cannot be a direct contribution. What you do instead is a backdoor. You contribute that $7,000 if you're under 50, or $8,000 if you're over 50, or any number, anything as long as it's below that. You can contribute directly to a traditional IRA. and then you immediately convert that money from a traditional IRA to your Roth. That's
So,
called the backdoor.
couple caveats on this. Thank you for explaining that. In order for this to work, you're putting in after-tax dollars, right? So you need to fill out on your tax returns that you did an after-tax contribution to that traditional IRA account. And then you immediately convert it to the Roth, but you do not want to have any other IRA accounts. You can have 401ks, but if you have another IRA account balance, the conversion is converted on a pro rata basis. So it's not completely tax-free, right? So I'll give an example of my wife and I. Before we got married, she had a 401k. We rolled it over to an IRA. All of my retirement savings had been in a 401k. So by the way, if you have a 401k, that does not prohibit you from doing this. 401ks are not part of this math. But if you have an IRA account, it will absolutely impact the ability to do this strategy going forward. And impact is subjective to your situation, and this is why we always say talk to a financial advisor. But it's one where if you have a traditional IRA and a number, so I'm going to make the math very, very simple. Let's say someone's under 50, they say they have a $70,000 traditional IRA. Let's say that they put $7,000 in to do this conversion. Well, they think that the $7,000 would be completely tax-free. No, it's not. Because you had a $70,000 traditional IRA and you put the $7,000 in, only in that example, 1/10 of the $7,000 conversion is treated as tax-free. So some of the planning work that might be worthwhile reviewing would be going ahead and converting that traditional IRA. Might be 1 year, might be incrementally. You look at what your tax rates are year over year, so that you then have the ability to do this strategy going forward. So going back to my wife and I, that was the pill that I had to swallow, was go ahead and convert her traditional IRA all at once to then free up future years, assuming you're not going to have more traditional IRAs, right? But free up future years to be able to do this backdoor Roth strategy. Fantastic way when we talk about savings to get money over into a Roth early, because there's a time value of money conversation. The earlier you can get the money in, it's growing completely tax-free. And when you take the money out, you're able to get the money out tax-free. By the way, a couple caveats on that. We didn't hit those yet. But in order for the money to come out on a Roth IRA tax-free, you have to be over the age of 59 and a half, and that Roth had to be in existence for 5 years. So it's important to kind of set the framework where, if you're thinking about it, this is a dedicated retirement bucket. Right? It's not designed to be, an accumulation bucket that you can pull money in and out of however you want to. Now, you can pull money out of a Roth IRA, the principal out, tax and penalty free at any point in time. But because it's so hard to get this money into those accounts, really do want to try to leave those alone. Now, Sydney, let's talk a little bit about the mega backdoor Roth strategy, because it's similar, but not quite.
Yep, exactly. So you have your regular backdoor and then their mega backdoor. It's bigger. You can get a higher dollar amount using this strategy. The mega backdoor utilizes employer plans that allow in-service withdrawals. That's an important caveat because a lot of plans don't offer in-service withdrawals. It's just not in their plan rules. So if you think this might be a strategy for you, definitely check with your 401k provider to see if it's even allowed to do this type of withdrawal. There's a couple different buckets in 401ks as well. The after-tax bucket in a 401k, you'll start spilling over to that bucket if you exceed the amount of pre-tax contributions. So for this year, for 2024, it's $23,000 worth of pre-tax contributions. When you start getting over that amount, it starts spilling over to an after-tax bucket. Unfortunately, that after-tax bucket, as the name would not imply, it grows. The contributions are after-tax, but the growth on it is pre-tax. So it's not in a Roth bucket. Roth is after tax and it grows tax-free as well. So this mega backdoor strategy, you can take the after-tax contributions, a portion of them, and roll them out into a Roth IRA and get them growing tax-free from there. I'll let you dive into a little bit of the details around that, James, but that's the gist of the mega backdoor strategy.
No, and so like, for example, to quantify the scope of these, we mentioned with a traditional Roth contribution, you have an income limitation, but you're restricted at $7,000 if you're under 50, additional $1,000 if you're over the age of 50. With the mega backdoor, you actually have the full latitude of the after-tax contribution amount that you can make within a 401k plan, which is significantly higher, almost $70,000. And so it's, sorry, I own a 70 if you're over 50. If you're under 50, it's 64 or 5. You got the number right there. So 64,500, right? So you're able to put the 23 in base, but then you're able to, whatever your employer contribution is, let's just say hypothetically the employer is going to throw in 15,000 for you, right? So now you're at 38 total, but that means that you actually can put in the difference between the 64.5 and the 38 in that example and use all of that to go into a Roth IRA. Now, administratively, how you actually do this, as Sydney mentioned, they have to allow for in-service distributions. Typically, those in-service distributions are once or twice a year, depending upon the plan and how it's structured. But what you do is you actually just call into the provider, say you want to do an in-service distribution. Odds are that after-tax contribution has had some growth on it, right? In normal market years, the money grows. Not every year it will, of course. Past performance, never indicative of future results. But the point is that if it has grown, and let's just say you put in, I'll make up the number, let's just say $21,000 in on an after-tax basis. Let's say it's grown to 23, right? So you got $2,000 worth of growth, a pretty decent return for the year. But what ends up happening is they have to do a ratio of what was put in on an after-tax balance versus what it's worth now. And then you're actually going to do the after-tax portion, that ratio would go to the Roth, and all of the gain has to get rolled over into a traditional IRA. This allows it to be a tax-free distribution from the plan. What typically happens though is because now we have set up where there's as I mentioned, the gain has come out, there's now a traditional IRA. A lot of times it precludes the active participant and the employee from no longer being eligible to doing the backdoor, right? So the financial advisors in us, by the way, we're going to have you save every dollar you make. We're going to have you work till you're 80. You're going to die at 81. They're horrible jokes, but the point is the more you save, the more you have. And if you're in the fortunate position to be able to plow some money into savings, well, setting it up to be able to do a significant amount of tax paid after-tax contributions into the 401k that then we can flip over to the Roth, that's a great planning strategy, and especially if we're in that mode of thinking longer term. So we love the backdoors. If really we're only talking about, let's just say $7,000, $8,000 a year is what we're able to save, that's probably the preferential way. Now, if you have a traditional IRA, that's going to preclude you from doing it. If you have a traditional IRA and then you have the ability to do it within your 401k plans at work, then let's go ahead and visit the mega backdoor as a strategy option, because that's a way that even if you had a traditional IRA and you're only putting 7,000 or 8,000 in, great, we'll go ahead and use that as the conduit to get them out. I mean, so there's a lot of ways to get money ultimately into a Roth IRA. But I do want to come back and talk a little bit about the need and why is this type of work so important. And I'm specifically talking about future effective tax rates, and I'm specifically talking about required minimum distributions. We haven't talked about that yet. So let's dive into that a little bit more, because I come back to all clients think everything should go to a Roth, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Really, I want to talk about why we integrate this from a planning perspective, how it's so important to be able to build these out. So talk to us a little bit, Sydney, about the difference between RMDs for a traditional IRA versus RMDs for a Roth IRA and how we would manage that.
Yep, exactly. So we've mentioned one of the main benefits of a Roth IRA is that tax-free growth. Another secondary, yet arguably still just as important benefit of Roth IRAs is that they do not have required minimum distributions or RMDs. They are not considered in the calculation for those RMDs. So the more money you have on the Roth side, the lower your RMDs will be. This, we will have plenty of clients say, well, I just want to convert everything into a Roth, pay tax once and be done. And I'll never have to send the government another dollar of my money ever again. And while that is a strategy, for a lot of people, it doesn't make sense to pay that big tax bill up front. And the no RMD portion of a Roth IRA, it's a great strategy. We'll usually use it as a bucket in someone's plan. namely for people who have large pre-tax assets. If they have a large 401k, maybe they had a really significant match throughout their career, they have a pension, so they have large amounts of qualified money, large pre-tax accounts. So those RMDs are going to be killer when they turn RMD age, most likely around 75, although that can fluctuate. So getting a bucket into RMDs, it shelters some of that money from being assessed.
And frankly, this is why I think having a plan is so important. Obviously, we're a little biased, but at the end of the day, when I look at the need to do tax optimization and tax planning, it's really only predicated off of one variable. You overly simplify this, but it really comes down to what is someone's withdrawal rate. And part of it comes down to, how much do they have versus how much are they spending? And so, for example, if someone's only spending 3% of their portfolio, it's going to grow. And that automatically is going to put them in a situation where required minimum distributions are going to be larger than what they want to spend, which puts them into what we would affectionately call tax prison. It means you're in higher tax rates than where you ultimately want to be. But if someone's drawn at 5-6% of their portfolio, now, by the way, those aren't sustainable withdrawal rates. I want to be clear about that. I mean, you're going to cause the portfolio to go down, but you're not going to be in a higher tax situation. So the need to do Roth conversions is almost negated, right? So the big driver here comes down to really what I would say is a very basic math equation of what are you spending versus what do you have? And as Sydney so accurately pointed out, if you have big pre-tax assets, and let's just say you've got a $3 million IRA account, but if you're spending $250 or $300 a year, well, we're not going to have an RMD problem. That's clear as day, right? But if you have $3 million and you're spending $60,000 to $90,000, yeah, we're going to have an RMD problem. And so I come back to that comment of we need to look at what your effective tax rate is going to be in the future versus what your effective tax rate is now. And then it becomes this discussion of, I don't want to be in a situation where a client is, while they're in their earning years at these higher tax rates, and then all of a sudden they go down into very low tax rates, and then RMD age hits back up and they're back up to very high tax rates. I don't want to be in that situation. The goal is to ultimately kind of smooth those out where, yeah, we will pay some tax along the way, but we're in a lower overall average effective tax rates than where we are going to be in the future. Another thing that we have to point out, as of current law right now at the end of 2025, tax rates are going up. That's law. Now, it's an election year. We'll see. We might see some changes. But the fact of the matter is, under current law, as we're building out plans, tax rates are going to go up. And so, I look at 2024, 2025, these are years currently that I would say, yeah, we should look at doing a little bit more in conversions because effective tax rates are going to go up 3% just in the base case, right? So it's just to emphasize the point that we've been making, Roths make sense, but so do IRAs. And so do non-qualified accounts, right? We need to look at each of those respective buckets and integrate it into your situation because that's going to be what has the most impact.
Yeah,
now,
there's no one size fits all for strategies around these. It's not, everyone has different earnings, different amounts of pre-tax qualified assets, and like James, you mentioned, different levels of spending, which is the biggest variable in somebody's plan.
Now, let's say we're in a situation where we want to give some money to our kids or our grandkids. What about Roths there?
Oh, Roths are great for that. Roths are a fantastic inheritance. Again, tax-free growth, especially when you're talking about younger people. They have all those years for that money to grow tax-free, unencumbered. So the time value of money really comes into play here. $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. So if you can get money into a Roth now and give it all that time to weather the storms of the market, have its volatility, and then be there when that person who is currently 20 years old is almost 60, then that Roth IRA is very likely going to be in a much, much better place.
And this is where the number one way to accumulate wealth, number one way is to continue to save, right? And so part of my line of thinking is, how do I incentivize that type of behavior? Maybe you're doing some type of matching for your kids, or helping relieve that saving component for your kids, et cetera. But Roths, as Sydney mentioned, are phenomenal for that, especially when we're in what we call the accumulation phase. I will emphasize, in order to do this, they need to have earned income, right? So it's not like a young child who has no job, we can just go put $7,000 into the Roth. That said, let's just say you have a teenager who has a summer job, lifeguarding, interning, whatever it is, we can put a number in for them into a Roth IRA. So let's say I have a client recently, daughter earned $2,500 over the summer. Okay, that's her taxable income. We can put $2,500 in now. And of course, the conversation is, well, how do we get her income up, right? So that we can put more in. But ultimately we are at that 7,000 level if they're under the age of 50. And if we have the ability to hit that, great. But otherwise, we're going to be limited at whatever their income level is respectively. So it's one of those where, as we're able to do some of this advanced planning work, and especially if we're in a situation where we're going to be leaving money behind, well, I love the idea of doing some lifetime gifts. Let's get some money in for kids, potentially grandkids if they have income. That's the most cost-effective way of doing some estate planning, and more importantly, has a very, very long time horizon. We did an illustration for a client of ours recently where we did a comparison of starting to put money into a Roth IRA at the age of 20 versus starting to put money in at a Roth IRA at the age of 30, just waiting 10 years. And assuming we maxed it out each year, so $7,000 all the way through, well, if we started at the age of 20 using an 8% growth rate, it's $1.67 million. It's in a Roth at the age of 59 and a half. Right? So a very significant amount of money. By the way, that's essentially 40 years at 7,000, right? So it wasn't like we're talking about a huge number, but time value money allows that to grow. Just by waiting until the age of 30, that dropped that 1.67 down to 980,000, right? So again, that's 70,000, 10 years at 7,000, $70,000 of difference, but also 10 years of time was huge in terms of the impact that it had. So this is one where we talk about the ability to save. If you have the ability to transition wealth to the next generation or help incentivize the types of behaviors that you're trying to see out of them, Roths are fantastic conduits. The negative, as we've already identified, is that money is not designed to be taken out for spending. Yes, they can get the principal if they want, but it really should be viewed as this is the retirement bucket. This is a long-term bucket. And we want to be using that for savings and accumulation of wealth. So what have we not covered today, Sydney, on this? I mean, we kind of hit a lot.
I want to touch a little bit on the demographics of people that have Roth IRAs. We talked about the statistics a little bit, but I think another thing that was very interesting to me was that 33% of Roth IRA owners are younger than 40. So, which is quite interesting to me. It makes sense. Younger people typically, right, that the earlier you are in your career, theoretically, the lower amount of money you earn. As you get older and you advance in your career, you get raises, things like that. You'd make more money, and then theoretically, maybe you'd phase out of being able to contribute to a Roth IRA. So younger people tend to invest into Roths more heavily than someone who's older. So we need to get those contribution numbers up. That's shocking to me that only 32 million have Roth IRAs, but only 15% are contributing.
An educated investor is an empowered investor. We need to keep educating, but that doesn't surprise me either, because Roth IRAs were only established in the 90s, and so if you're in a high tax bracket, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense to be jamming money into a Roth. So those that were, let's just say baby boomers and early year Gen Xers, right? So those that are now on the cusp and transition to retirement, it didn't make a lot of sense for them. It's millennials, Gen Zs, those are the ones that it makes a ton of sense for, because they're in that accumulation phase. But frankly, I do think it comes back to understanding what your effective tax rate is now versus what you project it to be in the future. If you never expect to make more money from where you are today, then sure, max out pre-tax. But if you're in a position where you've got upward mobility of your income, yeah, early phase, do a lot of Roth. At some point, you'll hit an income threshold where and again, that's self-interpreted based upon where you are now versus the future. But at some point, you'll hit an income perspective where it's better to do pre-tax versus Roth. And then if you have the excess, then we come back and do the backdoor or mega backdoors after, right? So, Sydney, thanks so much for the time today. This was fantastic. Really do appreciate it and look forward to having you back on future episodes.
Thank you, James. Appreciate it.
The previous podcast was intended for general information purposes only. The information discussed is no substitute for personalized investment advice from Bogart or another investment professional. Different types of investments involve varying degrees of risk, and it should not be assumed that the future performance of any specific investment, strategy, or service will be profitable, suitable, or successful. Bogart is not a law firm or accounting firm, and no portion of its services should be construed as legal or accounting advice. There is no guarantee a client will experience a certain level of results if Bogart is engaged. Our brochure describing services and fees can be found at www.bogartwealth.com.